let's begin by introducing Dr. Gail Dines, an absolute legend that I came across many years ago, like perhaps many of us did on via her TED Talk, which I still share frequently, abundantly, and purposefully with everybody I know who works with young people, because I think it's an absolute must. Dr. Dines, as many of you may know, is Professor Emerita of Sociology and Women's Studies. She's been researching and writing about the harms of pornography for over 30 years. She's a recipient of the Myers Center Award for the Study of Human Rights in North America and author of numerous books and articles. Her latest book, Pornland: How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality, has been translated into 5 languages. Dr. Dines is founder and president of the non-profit Culture Reframed, dedicated to building resilience and resistance in children and youth to the harms of a hypersexualized and pornified society. Culture Reframed develops cutting-edge educational programs that promote healthy development, relationships, and sexuality. Dr. Dines has worked with organizations such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, Centers for Disease Control, International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals, as well as government bodies in the US, Brazil, UK, Sweden, Iceland, Norway, Colombia, and Canada. She regularly appears on CNN, NPR, BBC, CBC, and writes for media outlets such as The Guardian, The Washington Post, Newsweek, and the Boston Globe. In short, on a personal note, she's an inspiration. Let me introduce Dr. Gail Dines.
Thank you so much, Michael, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Before I do this, I want to be sure that you know to give a trigger warning. Some of the stuff that you're going to hear today is going to be very upsetting and troubling. Please take care of yourselves. If you need to take a break, if you need to go for a walk, or you just feel that this is not for you, please take care of yourself. So what I'm going to talk about today is what it means to grow up in a porn culture. What are the social, emotional, sexual, and cognitive effects on adolescence? So when we go around the world lecturing to parents, to experts, what we find is that very few of them actually understand what's going on with pornography and how this a seismic shift has changed the world that young people grow up in. Now, what's interesting, who actually does know what's going on, of course, is the media. And this is from Details magazine, which is a kind of cosmopolitan for boys and men. And they had an interesting article called How Internet Porn is Changing Teen Sex. Now, they took a quote from Joanna Angel, who describes herself as, quote, a feminist pornographer. Well, you can't be a feminist pornographer. You're either a feminist or you're a pornographer. You have to make a decision. So what she did say, though, was very interesting. She said the girls these days, they just seem to come to the set porn ready. Now, clearly, what she's not saying is that all girls are going to end up on a porn set. However, she's actually saying something more profound. She's saying that we live in a culture that is training and socializing our girls to see themselves as disposable, pornified sex objects. And the question is, how do we actually socialize our girls to see themselves in this way? So I'd like to give a quote from the wonderful media critic, Neil Postman. And most of us today live in an image-based culture, but we were brought up, those of us over the age of 35, in a print-based culture. And what Neil Postman said, he said, when we were brought up in a print-based culture, we had some immunization to the seduction of eloquence of the printed word, to which I would add, we have no such immunization to the seduction of eloquence of the image. And in fact, now we know from neuroscience studies is that images actually bypass the rational part of the brain and land in that part of the brain that isn't actually up for rational discourse. So let's look at these images that float around the culture that are socializing agents for our young girls. So what we see is usually white, toned, young women. This is from Cosmopolitan, blonde, large-breasted, again, hypersexualized, and often in pornographic clothing. This kind of clothing was only in pornography 2 decades ago. Today, it has become mainstream, thanks largely to Victoria's Secrets. And again, the blonde, white, toned body, heaven forbid anything jiggles other than the breasts. Now, we do let some women of color into this pop culture, especially if they look like Beyonce or Rihanna or Cardi B. So what we notice when we look at women of color, specifically African-American women, we see that they're either dressed as animals or have animal skins painted on them. Now, this is an old trope coming down from slavery. And the idea was that African-American women are so hypersexualized that in fact they're animalistic. And you can't blame the poor white plantation owners for being driven into having so-called sexual relations, i.e. rape with these women. So that ugly trope that legitimized the wholesale rape of African-American women on the plantation has now come down to present day because these are very common images. So let's talk about how images work. So in media theory, we have a concept called the reader inscribed in the text. So I want you to look at her face, look at her body language, her clothes. Who do we think she's speaking to? And before you answer, do you think she's speaking to her mother, saying, let's have a cup of coffee after the photo shoot? No, clearly this is what we call the male gaze, G-A-Z-E. She's talking to men. And what is she saying? Well, I'm going to be succinct here, and please excuse my language, but we are talking about pornography and hypersexualized culture. What she's clearly saying is fuck me. And what we know about this culture is that the standard image for females is this vulnerability of offering themselves sexually. Now, in my classes, when I would ask young women to do the fuck me look, they could all go into it, you know, hands on hips, chest out, neck up. It looked perfectly normalized amongst my women students. Then I would ask a few brave men to come up and to do the fuck me look. And they had no idea what to do. We'd have to literally shout out instructions, put your hands here, put this. And then I'd have 3 women with the look and 3 men. And what was interesting was the 3 women with the fuck me look actually looked perfectly normalized. The 3 men, on the other hand, look ridiculous. The question is why? So the answer here is that we have now brought up half of the population to think that to be hot is to be sexually vulnerable, and the other half to think that to be sexually aggressive and assertive, because actually it's not fuck me that men have, the look is fuck you. So we bring them up to think that to be sexually aggressive, assertive, and hot is what it means to be a man in this culture. Now, throw in alcohol, throw in hookup culture, throw in the sex industry, and what have we laid the groundwork for? Rape. Which is why many researchers, feminist researchers, look at rapists and argue that men who rape are not deviants. They are in fact over-conformists to the societal messages. And in fact, as a sociologist, my main area of interest is not men who rape. That I understand, given the culture. It's men who don't rape. I'm interested to know what protective factors do these men have that they have refused to listen to all of the ideologies and the messages that patriarchy has been sending them from the word go. Now, what do we know happens to young women who internalize the hypersexualized culture? Well, the American Academy of Pediatrics, well over 10 years ago now, did a meta-analysis of the studies. And what they found is that girls self-sexualize. They internalize the images and they self-sexualize. And that the more a girl self-sexualizes and the more she self-objectifies, the more likely she is to suffer from anxiety, depression, body loathing, risky sexual behavior, early pregnancy, STIs, suicidal ideation, dropping out of school, self-harming, and sexual victimization. So this is what we're doing to our girls. Now, we actually commissioned an update to this study by Dr. Sharon Lamb, and you can find it on the Culture Reframed website. We've taken the studies up to 2020. So just before I was writing Pornland, I found myself in a local state prison interviewing 8 men, all of whom were in for downloading child sexual abuse images, child pornography, and then for raping a child. And the average space between downloading their first child pornography and raping a child was actually 6 months to a year. So one of them, a particularly unsavory one, who of course had no remorse, but none of them had no remorse, who had actually groomed his 10-year-old stepdaughter before he then raped her. And he kept using the word groomed to show how smart he was. And then he said something that forever shifted the way I think. He looked me straight in the face and he said, the culture did a lot of the grooming for me. And I have to say, I almost fell off my chair, because I thought, this is the piece of the puzzle I am missing. Because I had noticed a radical shift in my students. And what this perpetrator got right was that, in fact, the culture is now a mass perpetrator against our girls en masse. While we used to need an individual perpetrator to groom an individual girl, we now have a way more economical way of actually grooming our girls. And let's circle back to Joanna Angel's comment that, in fact, a lot of the girls come to the porn set porn ready. The pornographer speaks the same language as the sexual abuser. Why? Because they're both using and working from the same playbook, that they're understanding the culture as a perpetrating culture. So this is what we offer our girls. We say you either conform to the hypersexualized porn culture or you're invisible. In other words, you're either fuckable or invisible. Those are the 2 choices. And you know what? When you only have 2 choices on the table, they're not real choices. And when I say this in colleges and high schools, I hear a gasp from the young women, because they themselves know this is the world they're living in. And afterwards, I have a group of women on one side crying and often a group of men. But I'm going to talk about the women to start with, the young women. A lot of them will come up to me and say, I chose fuckability. I hate it. It's not who I am, but I don't want to be alone. And then I have another group of young women saying, I chose invisibility because I couldn't do fuckability, but I'm alone all the time. Nobody is getting anything out of this for women. This is not empowerment. This is not sexual liberation. This is, in fact, sexual exploitation en masse of our young women. So now let's have a look at pornography. And the same article was how internet porn is changing teen sex. And then they go on to say, there is an entire generation of young people who think sex ends with a money shot to the face. For those who don't know, a money shot is actually ejaculation on the face. I have watched way too much porn that is good for any human being. And I can tell you that I have never seen a porn scene that does not end in actual ejaculation on the face, and multiple men ejaculating on a woman, to the degree that before the porn industry shut down for COVID, what we found was an antibiotic resistant strain of gonorrhea of the eye, because the women were being ejaculated in the eye. Now, what we know from studies is that, specifically the Indiana University survey, is that we have a parental naivete gap, where parents really don't know what's going on, and often by a factor of 10 are underestimating what their kids are seeing. So now we have this perfect storm of sex education coming from the violent misogynist porn industry and parents who are not aware. And I'm not putting the blame on parents. If we're going to shame and blame anyone, we shame and blame the porn industry. So Anna Bridges, in her 2010 study, looked at 304 of the most watched scenes, and what she found is that 90% contained at least one aggressive act of violence against women. So let's look at what kind of acts are in there. Gagging, So if you go onto Pornhub, no matter what category you click on, whether it's MILF, ebony whores, teen sluts, you're going to get exactly the same sex acts. So the first one is gagging. This is where a penis is so far down the throat that she starts to gag. She can't choke, tears are streaming down her face. And as she's choking, the male porn performer gets her head and pulls it more towards the penis so that she's really choking. And sometimes the women vomit and they keep those scenes in. Now, gagging needs to be separated from strangulation, which is hands around the throat. Now, this is especially dangerous for a number of reasons. First of all, studies show that the more a woman is strangled by her batterer, the more likely she is to die at his hands. Secondly, what we know from strangulation is that you can be strangled till you pass out. And I've seen many women in the porn sites where their eyes start to roll back and they're passing out. And then you can pass out, wake up and think you're fine, go to bed, and then you could die within the week because it takes that long sometimes for your throat passages to actually swell up. Rough anal sex. Now, we're talking such rough anal sex that one of the problems of women who work in the porn industry is actually having their anuses literally drop out of their bodies. And the average woman in porn can only survive 3 months. Forget the notion of a porn star. There is a handful of women who are porn stars. The average woman is in the porn industry for 3 months and then enters the other parts of the sex industry. It's a very short ride from LA to the brothels of Nevada. Of course, ejaculation on the face, which we just discussed, hair pulling, spanking, spitting in the face. So the average porn scene that a boy can get to, and the average age is around 11, but it's getting younger. We're seeing now studies coming out with 8 is the average age. When they put in porn or boobies into Google, they are catapulted into a world of sexual violence and torture, where a woman is being gagged, strangled, being penetrated orally, anally, vaginally by 3 men or more, because sometimes there's 2 penises in the anus, 2 in the vagina, and 2 in the mouth, so 6. And she's being spat upon, called bitch, whore, cum dumpster, and then eventually covered in ejaculate. And when I watch these scenes, the first thought is, how do these women ever get up off the floor? Because if that happened to me, I couldn't imagine ever getting up off that floor. And not only did they get up off that floor, the next day they're doing the same thing. So we have to realize that at its very point of production, pornography is violence against women. We forget often to talk about the women in pornography. So when I was writing Pornland and was absolutely drenched in pornography and could barely stand it. So I was sometimes at some point, I was writing my notes with my hand before, just blocking out the image, writing the notes. And then I was thinking about my son. And I was thinking, who would he have been today as a young man if it's an 11-year-old, he would have got to this? And how would he have studied? How does the average 11-year-old boy stand to see this? So I started to look at the text that goes with the actual images. And this is from a site that was called Gag Me and Then Fuck Me. And I'm going to read what it says. Do you know what we say to things like romance and foreplay? We say fuck off. We take your gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. No, that's not true. Do not tell me that every man really wants to do this. Every man does not want to treat a woman like this. But you know what? This boy is 11 years old. He's got no repertoire of sexual history. He's probably never had sex. He is dependent on the porn industry to teach him sex education, because in most places, as we're going to discuss throughout the conference, sex education is hopefully inadequate for dealing with our students' lives today. So we take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. Can you see how they're saying to him, this is what it means to be a man? I want to give you another example. Promotional copy from a film called Anally Ripped Whores. Subtlety is not one of the things that the porn industry indulge in. So this is actually clearly from this Emerita tours. This is the promotional copy. We at Pure Filth know exactly what you want. Chicks being as fucked till their sphincters are pink, puffy, and totally blown out. Adult diapers just might be in store for these whores when their work is done. There's not much subtlety here. Very clear what they're doing to women. Importantly, we at Pure Filth know exactly what you want. No, you don't. Do not tell me that that 11-year-old boy thinks for 1 second that this is what he's going to get. When he puts whatever he puts into Google or through Instagram or Snapchat, he's not imagining this violence. So now I want you to put yourself in the place of this 11-year-old boy. He's been catapulted into this world of violence, and he's been told this is what he wants. So think about that toxic stew in his stomach of arousal, fear, self-loathing, and disgust. I would argue that the porn industry is not only traumatizing our girls en masse, but also traumatizing our boys. Who is he going to tell about this? He hasn't even got the words. And you know what? We know from studies that the first thing that trauma does is limit the capacity for language. It attacks that part of the brain where we produce language. So now what's happening is we are actually traumatizing a generation of boys. And again, we know from research that if you do not deal with the trauma, you keep reenacting the trauma over and over and over again. So how is this boy going to deal with it? He's going to go back to the site of the trauma, which is, of course, the porn websites. So what they're doing is they're building in addiction to the business model of the porn industry. A brilliant, brilliant business model, terrible for society. And I want to make it very clear here that if you look at the neuroscience literature, addiction to porn is real. And hopefully we'll have discussions as we go through the conference. But the studies are very clear that porn is addictive in the way it attacks the dopamine receptors and the way in which men and boys habitually use it. So how did we get here? How did we get from Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler to a multi-billion-dollar industry, which is completely unregulated and which is the major form of sex education today and is free? So look at the year 2000. This was a domestication of the internet. This made porn more affordable, more accessible, and more anonymous, the three major drivers of demand. It wasn't just that the internet drove pornography, porn drove the internet. A lot of the R&D money for the pop-ups, the pop-downs, the payment systems, this was provided by the porn industry. They are one step ahead of most big techs companies. We know no matter what methodology you use, 1 in 3 searches or a third of the internet is actually porn. So 30% to 33% of the internet is porn. Porn sites get more visitors each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. Now, we think about the value chain from production to consumption of pornography as lots of mom and pop shops all along the value chain. The truth is, at production, we have a lot of mom and pop shops. At distribution, one company controls the vast majority of distribution of pornography all over the world. This is called MindGeek. It is based in Montreal. It is now being investigated by the Canadian government. But at this moment, this is the Amazon of pornography. MindGeek owns 10 of the 15 most popular porn sites, and especially Pornhub. And what we see from Pornhub is that it's in the top 10 of most visited sites in the world. It's up there with YouTube, Facebook, and Google. So this is no small industry. This is a vast industry shifting the narrative and the sexual templates of boys and girls all over the world. So what do we know about visits to Pornhub? In 2019, they had 42 billion visits, a daily average of 100 million visitors, nearly 1,000 searches a second, and they uploaded nearly 5 million new videos. They've since had to take some of those down, but because of the hearings in Canada, but they're going to start putting them up again. So Pornhub traffic during the pandemic. So as most of the world is going into lockdown, realizing we're facing something that none of us who's alive today have really faced before, a massive global pandemic. What is the porn industry doing? You know how it's getting ready? It's one step ahead. What it does, literally the week that the world goes into lockdown, it makes its premium content free. Now, most of Pornhub is free. The premium content is just as violent, but tends to be a bit more technologically sophisticated. So this is their plan. They are way ahead of everybody else. So overnight, when they make their premium free, Italy saw visits increase to Pornhub 57%, France 38%, Spain 61%. And in the US, it went up 40% around 3 a.m. So now I wanted to think about what this means. You've got women and children in lockdown with men who are using more and more pornography. Is it any surprise that violence against women and children went through the roof during the pandemic? Is it any surprise that there's an increase in child sexual abuse images, production and consumption? Men were locked down in a home with vulnerable women and children who were having to deal with these men who were masturbating to pornography at increasing levels. Now I want to talk about cross-platform marketing to kids. So this is the new change that happened around 2014, 2015, the cell phone. This is when parents lost control. They were just about beginning to understand how to filter computers, how to have one in the middle of the room, etc. And in came the cell phone, which, by the way, was in co-development with the porn industry, and the porn industry worked on the screens so that you would have a clearer view, because they knew this was the way to get pornography into the hands of kids. So let's just look at the teen platforms. 84% of kids use Instagram, 80 Snapchat, 69 TikTok, 39% Twitter. Now, I think this time next year, TikTok is going to be #1. And by the way, in a lot of the seminars I've done with the FBI and Interpol, TikTok is the key site where sexual predators hang out. Now, this is Instagram. So Sunny Leone is one of the few porn stars. She has 40 million followers on Instagram, a teen platform. And you go onto her site on Instagram, you go onto her account, and you go from Instagram to Pornhub. So you can see how this works. Now, it's the same thing with Snapchat, but even worse, because you have companies that set up Snapchat accounts for porn performers. And what they do is they liaise between the social platforms for kids and the Pornhub. So what they promise, and the biggest company that does the liaising here is called Fancentro, part of the porn industry. They set up these accounts behind the premium wall that you have to pay for. And then what they do is they promise that if Snapchat should find your pornography, because ostensibly, but it's not really true, Snapchat says they don't allow porn, but they do. If Snapchat finds your porn account and shuts it down, we will have you up and running again within 24 hours so you don't lose any fans. This is the degree to which this industry is so sophisticated, has so many players along the value chain, and now we are now linking teen platforms to Pornhub. So Instagram, Snapchat, and other apps are gateway to porn industry. And I want to talk a little bit about OnlyFans. OnlyFans was founded in 2016 in Britain. The women make money, the content providers, they call them, for monthly subscriptions, creating custom content for fans, and tips and messaging. Now, sometimes how they get the money is they do one-on-one sex shows, or they get, they'll have a specific fan and they'll write to them, "Good morning, honey, how's your coffee today?" All those things you write, you get paid for. They have over 90 million users, that's mainly men, watching the women, sexualizing the women, watching the women perform sexual acts. And they have what they call over 1 million content creators. Now, content creators are women, they're real human beings, but they completely render them invisible by calling them content creators. Now, this is amazing. This is 1 million this year. That's up from 120,000 in 2019. This is COVID, where women were desperate for money. The platform takes 20%, which turns it into a pimp, of course. And why they say this is a safe way to interact with men sexually in the sex industry, what we know is that women are subject to doxing, capping. That's where you actually videotape the actual sex show and then upload it onto Pornhub and get money from that. They get death threats. So this is not safe at all. And they leave a big digital footprint that is going to make it difficult for them to get work later. Now, the interesting thing about this is they have a referral system. This is AKA pimping. So what they do is they say to the women, if you're not making enough money, which most of them are not, because I read somewhere that the average woman makes $300 a month, then if you bring a friend in, we will give her a percentage of what you're making. So not only are they pimping out women at OnlyFans, they're turning the women they pimp out to into pimps. So this is one big pimping pyramid scheme. So what do we know about the impact of porn on boys and men? We know from over 40 years of peer-reviewed studies, and these are just some meta-analyses, so that each one could be looking at 50 to 100 studies, that boys, the earlier boys get to porn, the more limited capacity for intimacy. The more likely they are to use coercive sexual tactics, including sexting, rape, risky sexual behaviors, more likely to have increased anxiety and depression, habitual addictive use, and erectile dysfunction. Now, the boys exposed to porn, I'm just going to give you a few studies, are 3.3 times more likely to engage in problematic sexual behaviors. Boys who intentionally sought out porn, 6 times more likely to self-report sexually aggressive behavior. This is where girls and women become the collateral damage of the porn industry. This study, by the way, is causal, not correlational, because it was longitudinal. A meta-analysis of longitudinal studies shows that boys exposed to porn more likely to sexually harass, and nearly 70% of boys who frequently daily use porn reported that porn made them want to do some of these acts. Now, there is a ton of studies, and if you go to culturereframed.org and go on our academic library, we have over 400 studies uploaded, peer-reviewed. We have a system whereby you can search for whatever you need. So it is the only library that I know that exists now when you're doing research to look at the harms of pornography. So the future. One of the things, so what we know from Jules Jordan is, and this is 2003, is that the so-called fans want more extreme. So what is the more extreme? So let me give you an example of the categories. Amateur, which is one of the categories on Pornhub, has nearly 305,000 videos. Big tits, 267. Teens, 262,000. And by the way, amateur porn is not amateur porn. Amateur porn is a subset of the porn industry that is produced by the porn industry to make it look amateur. Now, look, teens look like number 3. If you go into the back end and you look at the tags, that means when men are looking for young-looking girls, what other terms do they put in? They put teen, step, daddy, cheerleader, babysitter, and look at the amount of videos. 200,000 for teen, 84,000 for step, 97,000 for solo female, 55,000 for daddy. These are just some of them. So if you add it up, the most searched terms on Pornhub are for young-looking girls, youthful-looking girls. Now we get into the really depressing area. What are studies finding? Clinical experience and research evidence are now accumulating to suggest that the internet is not simply drawing attention to those with existing pedophilic interests, but is contributing to the crystallization of these interests in people, i.e. men, with no explicit sexual interest in children. Do you understand the enormity of this finding? That men who are not pedophiles are becoming desensitized by porn and are now developing an interest in children. They're not pedophiles. Remember those 8 men I interviewed in the state prison? When I said to them, are you pedophiles? They said, no, we prefer sex with adult women. So I said, then why did you download child pornography and rape a child? And you know what their response was? We were bored. We wanted something different. So we have now expanded the number of men who are raping children, and get your head around this, they're not pedophiles, and we've expanded the number of children at risk. So this is what we're seeing: desensitization, boredom, and addiction to pornography, leading them down the rabbit hole to legal childified images, i.e. those are on Pornhub, to actual child sexual abuse images. This is going down the rabbit hole. So we now have to change our toxic culture. And we at Culture Reframed say the Gulliver strategy: throw everything we've got at this. So for government legislation, we say bring in age verification at the point of production and consumption. Now, this was meant to come in the UK, and suddenly it disappeared, where a third party gets age verifies everyone who wants to go on a porn site. We need to be fighting for this. We need to hold social media platforms responsible for content. They argue they're just carriers. No, they are also content producers. And there was a decision by a judge in California just a few weeks ago that indeed said they're content producers, which is opening the door to a cornucopia of lawsuits. Adopt Utah's new law where you filter by default when you're buying a phone so that you can't get porn, and adults are given a PIN to remove the filter. Enforce code 2257 where you have to make sure everyone on a porn set is 18 or above. Now, of course, this is not going to solve all the problems, but what we do is we come at this every which way. We tie it down regulation by regulation. One of the most effective ways is do class action suits all along the value chain, from recruitment to production to distribution. Examples: we can do class action suits. Go after the porn industry for trafficking, pimping, and fraudulence. And in fact, there are a number of cases out there suing Pornhub. Go after them for the physical, emotional, and harms done to women on the set. We could do tons of class action suits on behalf of these women. And then go after them on the harms they've caused to women's reputation in porn, and the harms to women outside of porn, and the harms to children accessing porn. We could be doing class action suits through to the next century. And this is the way we bankrupt them. The only language the porn industry speaks is money, not sex. So we need to go where it really hurts, which is bankrupt them. A method that Culture Reframed has used is to educate parents and professionals so they have the skills, confidence and tools to help build resilience and resistance in kids. Samantha Wexler, our executive director, and Mandy Sanchez will be talking about this later on in the conference. So this is what we do at Culture Reframed. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to say, take some of the questions now. And I want to end by saying that the pornographers have given us no choice. We have to do something here. We have to act. We cannot allow them to hijack the sexuality of our children, and we cannot allow them to continue with the misogyny and the violence that it perpetrates against women, both on the set and off the set. It is about time we say to the pornographers, we've had enough, we're coming after you, and that slow boiling rage, not too much because we need to deal with it, we are going to harness into all of the activism we can so that we regulate you out of existence. Thank you.